He was broken, half his weight, half his spirit, and left to die behind a rotting fence. The others had been fed, cared for, loved. But not him. He was the runt, the rejected, the forgotten, until a 10-year-old girl, grieving her own kind of loss, heard a sound no one else bothered to hear. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She opened her arms and changed everything. If you believe that even the smallest voice can save a life, then stand with Hazel. Comment "He matters" to show you do. And come with us into a story of healing, hope, and the kind of love this world desperately needs. The sound was so faint it almost disappeared into the breeze. A thin, fractured whimper, something between breath and pain. Hazel Carter stopped mid-step on the gravel path behind her grandmother's garden, her ears sharpening like a deer catching the scent of danger. She stood still, heart pausing, eyes drifting to the left where a rusted chain-link fence separated their modest backyard from the overgrown chaos of the abandoned Forsyth property. No one lived there anymore. Hadn't in years, not since the fire in the kitchen left black scars up the siding and frightened away the last tenants. Since then, the grass had grown wild and knee-deep, the shed out back sagged on one side like a drunken old man, and the place had earned its reputation as a forgotten corner of Mapleford. Hazel clutched the notebook she'd been sketching in and inched closer to the fence. Hazel, just 10 years old but already heavier with grief than most adults could bear, was a thin wisp of a girl with sand-colored hair in uneven braids and dark brown eyes that seemed to observe more than they should. She had moved into her grandmother's one-story brick house 6 months ago after the accident. An unspoken event marked only by the quiet stares of adults and the sudden way children stopped asking her to play. Her voice had grown quieter, her gaze more intense. But if there was one thing she hadn't let the silence take, it was her heart. The whimper came again, and this time it carried desperation. She pressed her fingers into the chain link and peered through. That's when she saw him. At first, he looked like a pile of leaves stuck to the peeling white paint of the shed. But then the leaves shifted. A tiny, emaciated German shepherd puppy, no more than 5 weeks old, lay curled into himself, ribs jutting from his sides, fur matted and dull. His ears drooped low, one folded unnaturally, and his back bore 2 small, darkened wounds that looked too precise to be accidental. As Hazel stepped closer, the pup raised his head slightly, then dropped it again as if the effort had drained what little strength he had left. A few feet away, a cluster of larger puppies, his siblings, perhaps, wrestled and nuzzled one another, plump and lively. Their mother, a lean adult shepherd with sharp eyes and a ragged coat, stood over them, alert. But she showed no interest in the runt. None at all. Hazel swallowed hard. She had read about animals rejecting the weakest of their litter. Nature's way, some said. But this wasn't nature, it was cruelty. And it stirred something in her chest, something that burned beneath the grief she wore like a coat. She stepped back and turned, breaking into a run, her thin sneakers thudding softly on the worn path back to the house. The screen door creaked as she opened it, letting the smell of rosemary and old wood greet her like it always did. The living room was dim and quiet, save for the rustling of a newspaper and the rhythmic tick of a kitchen clock. "Gran?" she called. "Gran, I need to." "What's that tone in your voice, Hazel May?" came the reply, dry and clipped. Eleanor Ellie Carter, Hazel's grandmother, was a wiry woman in her early 70s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and a spine that never bent. Even under the weight of 2 wars, a widowhood, and the loss of her only child, her hands were always busy, knitting, shelling peas, or folding linens, and her mouth often twisted in disapproval, though her eyes betrayed a softness that refused to die. Life had taught her not to trust the world, not after it took her husband in Vietnam and her daughter in a highway pileup. "There's a puppy," Hazel said, breathless, "behind the Forsyth shed. He's hurt. He's alone." Ellie sighed without looking up. "That's none of our business, child. Dogs have their way just like people. The ones too weak don't make it. That's the way of it." Hazel's throat tightened. "But he's suffering." Ellie folded the newspaper and stood, tall and straight-backed in her pressed slacks and buttoned blouse. And we don't interfere with what we can't fix, she said firmly. You will not bring that dog in here. But Hazel started. No, Hazel. The finality in her voice was an iron gate slammed shut. Hazel didn't speak. She turned, walked to her room, and shut the door gently. Then, under the glow of a tiny desk lamp, she tore a sheet from her notebook and began to write. Dr. Amos Linwood, I don't know if you remember my parents. They used to bring our cat Junebug to your clinic. I'm Hazel. I found a puppy. He's not doing well. His mom doesn't want him. I think he might die. Please tell me what to do. Hazel May Carter. She folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope addressed to the old veterinary office 2 blocks away. Though the sign was faded and the front door locked, she'd seen a curtain twitch once or twice when she walked by. She hoped someone inside still cared. The next morning, she slid the letter through the mail slot and made her way back toward the fence. The puppy was still there. Worse, maybe. He barely lifted his head when she approached. Hazel waited until the mother dog turned away, then crawled through a bent section of the fence, heart pounding. She wrapped the puppy in the soft flannel blanket she'd smuggled from her room, tucking him against her chest. He smelled of dirt and rot, but his body was feather-light, like picking up a ghost. That's when she heard the laugh. Well, look who's saving trash today. Hazel turned. Standing across the alley was Jenny Harrow, 17, tall and wiry with half-bleached hair, too much eyeliner, and a cigarette pinched between 2 chipped nails. She was a senior at Mapleford High and known for skipping class, mouthing off, and tagging alley walls with angry words. Jenny's mother had left town years ago, and her father, when sober enough to be found, was the reason most neighbors kept their curtains closed. Jenny's eyes were sharp and hard, but beneath that brittle armor was something else, something fractured. Hazel held Nova tighter. He's not trash. Jenny smirked and flicked ash toward the fence. Sure looks like it. Probably won't last the week. She turned to go, but as she did, Hazel caught something strange. An almost imperceptible pause in Jenny's stride. A lingering glance. Not quite pity. Not quite detachment. Just haunted recognition. Hazel said nothing. She adjusted her grip and began the walk back to her yard. Nova's head nestled under her chin, his body trembling like the last leaf of winter clinging to a tree. She knew she'd be in trouble. She knew her grandmother would say no again. But none of it mattered, because when she whispered the name Nova into his ear and saw his eyes flicker in response, something stirred. Not just in him, but in her. A spark. A vow. She would save him, even if the world had already decided he wasn't worth saving. Hazel's room was still cloaked in the navy hush of early morning when she rose. She dressed in silence, her hands moving with the stiffness of worry. The flannel blanket she'd used to wrap Nova now bore the faint scent of sour milk and earth, and she tucked it under her arm along with a flashlight and a crust of leftover bread wrapped in wax paper. The kitchen floor groaned beneath her feet as she crept past the living room, where Ellie's recliner sat like a sentry under the dim flicker of a reading lamp she'd forgotten to turn off. Outside, the spring air bit at Hazel's arms as she crossed the yard toward the garden shed. The structure sagged to the left slightly, its roof speckled with moss and thyme, and its door hung just off the hinge. Hazel pulled it open carefully and slipped inside. Nova lay curled on the blanket in an old fruit crate she had turned into a makeshift bed. His breathing was shallow but rhythmic, his body twitching occasionally with discomfort. His fur remained dull and sparse in patches, the wounds along his back crusted but not yet infected. When Hazel knelt beside him, he opened one eye. She smiled. "I brought breakfast," she whispered, dipping the bread into a cup of warm water she'd heated earlier and letting it soften. He sniffed it, then licked her fingers slowly. He was too weak to chew, but he tried, and that was enough to keep her going. Hazel spent the morning tending to him, wiping down his paws with a wet cloth and picking the small thorns from his fur. At one point, he attempted to lift his head, only for it to fall gently back onto the blanket, his ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. When she heard the screen door creak open from the house, Hazel froze. Hazel May. The voice was firm but not angry. Hazel stepped out of the shed, brushing hay from her jeans. Ellie stood on the porch in her robe and slippers, arms crossed, a cup of black coffee steaming in one hand. Her eyes, though narrowed, held no surprise. "I told you not to bring that animal here." Hazel lowered her gaze. "I didn't bring him inside. You think hiding him out there makes it any better?" "I couldn't leave him," Hazel whispered. "He was dying." Ellie took a sip of coffee and stared across the yard. "And you think you can stop that?" Hazel said nothing. She expected the door to slam, to be grounded, for Nova to be taken away. But Ellie sighed instead. "So long as he stays out there, and he doesn't become my problem." She turned and walked back inside. Hazel exhaled so sharply it made her dizzy. Her knees nearly gave out as she sat back down beside Nova. "We've got a little time now," she murmured. "Let's use it." That afternoon, Hazel returned to the veterinary office. The building stood at the end of Linden Street, shaded by a tall ginkgo tree whose leaves had only just begun to open. She didn't see anyone when she approached, and the windows remained dark. Still, she knelt by the door and placed another note beneath the mat, along with a small, clumsily wrapped bundle. A sketch of Nova she had drawn, with a plea scribbled beneath. "Please, anything helps." Hazel had just turned to go when she heard a soft creak. From one of the mail slots near the side of the building, a brown paper bag slid out and landed gently on the step. Hazel blinked. She turned, but no face appeared in the narrow window behind it. Only the slightest ripple of movement in the curtain. She stepped forward and picked up the bag. Inside were 3 small bottles, one filled with a pale yellow liquid, another with cotton swabs, and the last with an unlabeled clear solution. At the bottom of the bag was a folded note. "Clean the wounds twice a day. Mix half a cap of the yellow with warm water. Hydrate frequently. Don't expect too much too fast. He might not make it, but if he's fighting, you fight too." There was no name, no signature, but Hazel smiled anyway. That night, as she crept out again to the shed, she didn't realize someone was watching. Across the street, partially hidden behind a cracked fence post, Jenny Harrow crouched in the dark. Her usual smirk was gone, replaced with a quiet, contemplative look. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and her hair, tied in a lazy knot, brushed her cheek with each breeze. Jenny had always been quick with her tongue, sharp with insults, but the truth was that behind the eyeliner and bravado was a girl who watched more than she spoke. She hadn't meant to follow Hazel that first night. She just happened to see her dragging the red wagon down the alley, the little form inside wrapped like a ghost. Something about it had unsettled her. Something about the way Hazel touched that sick, broken creature like it mattered. Jenny's father, Roy, was a mechanic by trade but had stopped fixing anything long ago. His hands now curled around beer cans and angry words, and Jenny had long since stopped expecting gentleness from anyone. She lived in a house where silence was safer than speech. But Hazel was out here nursing roadkill with tears in her eyes and fire in her gut, and Jenny couldn't look away. From her hiding spot, Jenny saw Hazel open the shed door, adjust the blanket, and use a cloth to dab at the puppy's wounds with the careful precision of someone doing sacred work. There was no hesitation in her hands, only care. The sight left Jenny confused, annoyed, intrigued. "Stupid dog," she muttered under her breath. "Should have been dead days ago." Still, she didn't move. She stayed there, hidden in the dark, until Hazel finished and slipped quietly back inside. The next day, Hazel opened the shed door to find a can of soft dog food placed just inside. No note, no explanation, just the can, dented slightly, with a faded label and dust on the rim. She stared at it for a long time, then smiled. She fed Nova that morning with trembling hands. He licked at the paste greedily, his appetite growing. That afternoon, she cleaned the wounds again, following the instructions from the mystery note. She read aloud from Charlotte's Web and watched as Nova blinked slowly, his ears flicking in rhythm with her voice. Outside, in the alley beyond the fence, Jenny leaned her back against the wall and lit a cigarette with shaking fingers she'd never admit were shaking. She didn't know why she left the food, didn't know why she planned to do it again. She just knew that the image of Hazel sitting beside that dying dog, whispering kindness into the dark, had wedged itself beneath her ribs and wouldn't let go. Hazel Carter had never known how heavy silence could be until it became the rhythm of her life, punctuated not by laughter or bedtime stories, but by the soft creak of floorboards at midnight and the whisper of wind through broken panes. The nights had begun to stretch thin and taut, each one stitched together by alarm clocks and whispered promises. Every 2 hours, she rose like clockwork. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone would even notice if she didn't, but because a small life was counting on her to show up, again and again without fail. The shed was cold at night, even in late spring. The tin roof caught the moonlight like old armor, and the air smelled of rust, straw, and distant lilac blooms. Inside, nestled in his fruit crate bed, Nova lay curled like a question mark. His body too thin, his breathing still shallow. Yet something had begun to change. His eyes, once dull and empty, now followed Hazel's movements. He blinked slower, watched longer. He no longer flinched at the sound of her voice. And when she cupped his head gently to guide a dropper of milk into his mouth, he licked her fingers afterward, just once, like a child saying thank you. Hazel sat beside him that night on a flattened box, wrapped in an old hoodie that still smelled faintly of her father's aftershave. She fed him slowly, one drop at a time, her hand steady despite the ache in her shoulders. The milk was warm, the consistency just right. She'd learned how to mix it by heart. As he finished, she used a cotton square to wipe his mouth, then gently adjusted the blanket around his legs. The wounds on his back had scabbed, but they needed cleaning twice a day with the pale yellow solution Dr. Amos had anonymously provided. The second bottle, the one with the clear liquid, was almost empty now. As Hazel reached for a fresh cloth, she noticed something unusual tucked under the shed door. It was a canister, short, fat, the label peeling, but unmistakably a container of powdered puppy milk. No note, no name, just there. Hazel picked it up, her brows furrowing. Then her lips curled ever so slightly. She didn't need a signature. She knew. The next morning, she stood at the edge of the fence, peering across the narrow alley that separated her backyard from the Harrow residence. The house looked tired, windows always half shut, shingles missing, the porch sagging as if exhausted from holding itself together. Hazel didn't expect to see Jenny. She never did. But just as she turned away, a curtain moved on the second floor. A flash of pale skin, a glint of eyes watching. Hazel gave a nod, nothing more. She didn't wait for a reply. Back in the shed, Nova was awake. Barely. But he lifted his head as she approached, a tremor running through his limbs. She smiled and crouched beside him, pouring warm water into a small bowl and dabbing at the dried crust near his ears. As she worked, she hummed, an old lullaby she didn't remember learning. The words had faded long ago, but the melody stayed, low and soft and full of longing. It was during the third night of this routine that Hazel found something else. A square of paper, folded and tucked between the crate slats where Nova slept. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, almost impatient in its precision. It read, "You'll need eye drops. Cloudiness in the cornea means dehydration. Left them on the porch." No name. No greeting, but Hazel's chest swelled. She tucked the note in her pocket and ran to the house. True to the message, a small brown bottle sat in a paper bag on the front step, beside a packet of gauze and a roll of medical tape. It was the first time Dr. Amos had left anything so directly. Hazel had never seen him in person, only glimpsed him once, years ago, during a trip to the vet with her mom. He'd been taller than she expected, with a white beard that reminded her of stories and a limp that made every step sound like a clock tick. She'd heard whispers since, about how he closed his clinic after losing a dog during surgery. A therapy dog, they said. One he'd raised himself. After that, he stopped seeing patients. Stopped talking to most people at all. But now, little by little, he was speaking again. Through supplies, notes, and unspoken faith. That same night, as Hazel finished tucking Nova in, she noticed something strange outside the shed. A soft scuff, a shadow passing by. She stepped out, flashlight in hand, and scanned the yard. Nothing. only the wind, until she turned and saw it. A faint silhouette retreating down the alley. Tall, slim, hoodie pulled up. Jenny. Hazel didn't call out, didn't move, just watched. And Jenny, pausing briefly, glanced over her shoulder before vanishing into the dark. Hazel said nothing to her grandmother, who had grown quieter these days. Ellie no longer asked questions about the shed. She no longer commented on Hazel's muddy shoes or missing bread. But something shifted on the fourth night, just after Hazel had settled Nova back into his crate and laid her head against the wood floor beside him. The door creaked open. Hazel sat up, startled. Ellie stood there in her nightdress and slippers, a folded blanket in her arms. Her silver hair was braided loosely down her back, a style Hazel had never seen on her before. She looked older in the half-light, softer. She didn't speak, simply crossed the shed slowly and knelt beside the crate. Her knees cracked as she lowered herself. She didn't wince. "This used to be your granddad's," she murmured, spreading the thick woolen fabric beside Nova's body. "He had bad knees," said this was the only thing that kept the cold out. Nova blinked at her, eyes glistening in the dim. Ellie reached out and touched his ear, just once. Then she stood, nodded at Hazel and walked away. Hazel didn't follow. She wrapped Nova gently in the wool, pressing her cheek to the side of his neck. His heartbeat, faint but firm, drummed steadily beneath her fingers. That night Hazel didn't cry, but she slept beside him, for the first time, without dreaming of wreckage and sirens. Outside, tucked just under the edge of the fence, a second can of puppy milk powder waited, carefully wrapped in a plastic bag against the rain. It happened just after midnight, on the tail end of a storm that had rattled Mapleford's windows and flooded its gutters. The rain had softened to a misty drizzle, and the air smelled of wet earth and cedar mulch. Hazel sat cross-legged on the shed floor, rubbing Nova's belly in slow circles. The crate had been replaced with a low cardboard box lined with an old pillow and 2 layers of flannel. The wool blanket from her grandfather was folded neatly beside it. For the first time in days, Nova had managed to stand for more than a few seconds. His legs were still shaky, but when Hazel placed a shallow dish of chicken broth beside him, he licked it clean, lapping the liquid with quiet determination. Hazel was telling him about the time she and her dad got caught in a thunderstorm during a camping trip, how they had built a blanket fort in the back seat of their truck and pretended they were explorers hiding from jungle beasts. Her voice softened when she spoke of him now, not because the grief had disappeared, but because Nova had somehow made the silence less suffocating. Then it happened. A sound scratchy, unformed, somewhere between a cough and a yelp, escaped Nova's throat. Hazel froze. Nova blinked at her, then gave another effort. This time it was unmistakable. A bark. Barely audible. Pitiful even. But it was a bark. Hazel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes faster than she could blink them away. "Nova," she whispered, dropping to her knees and pulling him gently against her. "You did it. You really did it." Nova wagged his tail once, feebly, and nuzzled into her chest. Hazel laughed through the tears, holding him like something holy. Later that morning, Hazel entered the kitchen to find her grandmother already awake. Her sleeves rolled up, mixing something in a wide ceramic bowl. Ellie Carter, in daylight, looked almost younger when she was focused. Her long silver braid draped over one shoulder, her hands moving with the kind of quiet precision only years of repetition could bring. "What are you doing?" Hazel asked cautiously. Ellie didn't glance up. "Boiling rice and chicken livers," she said. "Good for a recovering stomach." Hazel's eyes widened. "For Nova," Ellie shrugged. "Unless you plan on eating it." Hazel couldn't help herself. She rushed forward and hugged her around the waist. Ellie stiffened for a moment, then rested one damp hand on Hazel's back. She didn't speak, but her eyes were moist when Hazel pulled away. That afternoon, the knock came. Hazel opened the door to find a man standing there, tall and gaunt. His coat buttoned to the neck, though the air was mild. Dr. Amos Linwood looked exactly like Hazel remembered him from years ago. An older man with a trim white beard, olive skin weathered with age, and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He wore a gray cap and carried a leather satchel that had seen better days. His right leg favored the ground less confidently, and he leaned slightly on a walking stick shaped like a shepherd's crook. "You're Hazel," he said, his voice deeper than she expected, gravelly but calm. "Yes," she replied, blinking. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, glancing past her. "Thought I'd check on my former patient." Hazel stepped aside, barely breathing. "He's in the shed." They crossed the backyard in silence. When Dr. Linwood entered the shed, he paused, taking in the smell of antiseptic and hay, the gentle hum of an old battery-powered heater, and the way Nova lifted his head, ears twitching. Hazel watched as the old man knelt, slowly, with some effort, beside the dog. He didn't speak at first, just examined Nova's eyes, gently pressed his ribs, checked the healing wounds along his spine. "How long has he been standing on his own?" he finally asked. 3 days, Hazel replied. "He barked last night, twice." Dr. Linwood nodded. "He's stronger than I expected. Will he make it?" Hazel's voice cracked. The man didn't answer right away. "It's still a narrow edge he's walking," he said at last. "Infections can come back. His lungs are weak. Malnutrition that early can affect development long-term. But," he looked at Hazel, his face unreadable, "he's fighting. You're fighting. That counts for something." He stood, dusted off his coat. "Keep the eye drops going. Hydration's key. And don't be afraid to hope. Just don't be reckless with it." As he turned to go, Hazel called out, "Why did you help us, even when you stopped being a vet?" He paused at the gate. "Once, I had a dog named Echo. He saved people. Then one day he needed saving, and I wasn't enough. I shut the door on a lot of things after that. Then came your letters." Hazel stepped forward. "Nova's not Echo." "No," he said, his eyes softening. "But maybe you're the one I was supposed to answer." Later that day, Hazel took Nova out into the sun. He blinked against the brightness, sniffing the breeze. She set him on a thick towel in the yard, beside a water bowl and a small toy, an old stuffed raccoon missing one ear. He nudged it with his nose, tail twitching. That's when Jenny appeared. She didn't come from the alley this time. She walked through the gate, hands stuffed into the pockets of her denim jacket. Her hair was tied in a messy knot, eyeliner smudged. She stopped a few feet away and looked down at Nova, who turned his head slowly to examine her. "Still breathing?" she asked. Hazel nodded. "He barked." Jenny raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? Twice?" Jenny studied Hazel for a moment, then sat on the low brick wall nearby. "You know, it's not going to change anything, right?" Hazel didn't answer. Jenny pulled at a thread in her sleeve. "You'll go to school, kids will still call you weird. He'll probably always limp. You can't save everything." Hazel turned to her, her eyes level and clear. "If you were Nova," she said quietly, "would you want someone to give up on you?" Jenny didn't reply. A long moment passed. Then she stood. "See you around." But before she left, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded plastic bag. Inside, a new chew toy and a packet of meat-based training treats. She placed it beside Hazel without a word and walked away. That night, Hazel tucked Nova into his bed, humming the same tune as always. He shifted, got comfortable, and gave a low, uncertain sound, half bark, half sigh. Hazel laughed softly, and in the next room, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, slicing chicken livers with surprising tenderness. Outside, the town slept, but in a tiny shed behind a quiet house, a small voice had returned to the world. The first warm day of June arrived not with fanfare but with the hush of morning dew and the golden hush of sunlight spilling across rooftops. In the backyard, Hazel laid a quilt in the grass and gently set Nova down, his limbs still trembling slightly with each movement but no longer folding beneath him. His coat had begun to show signs of life, less patchy now, darker, with a sheen that danced in the light when he shifted. His ribs no longer screamed through his skin, and though he remained small for his age, He moved with more awareness, more curiosity. The bark from a few days before had not repeated, but Hazel wasn't worried. Nova had learned to wag his tail. That alone felt like a song. Hazel sat beside him with a book in her lap, reading softly. The library had reopened last week, and Mrs. Camber, the elderly librarian with thick glasses and a voice like creased paper, had saved her a copy of The Tale of Despero. Nova didn't understand the words, of course, but when Hazel read aloud, he tilted his head as if trying to follow the rhythm. When she paused, he'd rest his muzzle on her foot. Jenny was there too, though she pretended not to be. She sat at the edge of the yard, a faded hoodie pulled over her hair, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. She didn't speak much, but she came often now, bringing things she never explained. Half-used brushes, an old dog bowl, once even a tennis ball with only one bite mark in it. Hazel always said thank you. Jenny never replied. Hazel didn't mind. Sometimes silence was just another kind of conversation. It happened quickly. A flash of tan fur from the neighboring yard, a growl that tore through the quiet like a blade, and then chaos. The neighbor's dog, Bruno, a young male pit lab mix, muscular and unneutered, came barreling through a loose slat in the fence. Bruno had always been excitable, often left unsupervised in the yard behind the Garcias rental home. His owner, Mr. Garcia, was a shift worker at the steel plant. Tall and often tired, always apologizing for Bruno's behavior but never quite managing to rein him in. Bruno lunged with a bark that sent Hazel's book flying. Nova, caught off guard, froze. His legs locked, and his body went rigid with fear. The larger dog collided with him, teeth bared. Not biting yet, but snarling, aggressive. Hazel screamed, throwing herself between them, her arms outstretched. Jenny was faster. She dove forward, grabbing Bruno's collar and yanking him back with surprising force. "Hey, get off!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with panic. Bruno thrashed once, then retreated, startled by the sudden command. Seconds later, Mr. Garcia arrived from the alley, breathless and swearing, pulling the dog back through the fence with endless apologies. Hazel dropped to her knees beside Nova. He hadn't been bitten, not seriously. Just a small tear along his hind leg where Bruno's paw had scraped him in the scuffle. But Nova shook violently, his eyes wide and distant. He pressed his body into Hazel's side with a desperation that broke something loose in Jenny's chest. Dr. Amos arrived 20 minutes later, not summoned, but seemingly knowing, as he always did. Hazel had called him once from the rotary phone in the kitchen, her voice trembling. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I'll meet you at the clinic." The veterinary clinic looked unchanged. Still weathered, the green trim flaking from the shutters, the sign overhead half faded. Inside, it smelled of rubbing alcohol, lavender soap, and something earthy, like hay and age. The walls were lined with old photos. Animals, smiling children, handwritten notes. The waiting room was dark, the lights left off to save electricity, but the back room glowed warm under a single lamp. Dr. Amos stood waiting, sleeves rolled up, stethoscope around his neck. As they entered, Nova whimpered softly, curling tighter into Hazel's arms. Dr. Amos took him gently, speaking in a low voice as he examined the injury. "It's shallow, clean tear. He'll be fine physically. But he's shaking," Hazel said, hovering nearby. "He won't stop." "He remembers," Amos said. "Fear roots deeper than wounds." As he disinfected the cut, his hands moved with practiced ease. Then he paused, his gaze distant. "I had a dog once," he said, almost to himself. "His name was Echo, shepherd mix, big stubborn thing. He was my partner." Hazel and Jenny listened. "Echo worked in therapy," Amos continued. "Hospitals, retirement homes, even classrooms. He had this way of knowing who needed him most. He'd curl up next to kids too anxious to speak, lie beside war vets who hadn't talked in months. He saved people. That's what he did." "What happened to him?" Hazel asked quietly. Dr. Amos looked down at his hands. "Cancer. Fast and cruel. I missed the signs. Thought it was fatigue, just old age. By the time I caught it, there was nothing to do. He died on my watch. In my clinic. I closed it a week later. He stood, nodding at Nova. But this one, he's trying. Just like Echo did. Fear will pass if love stays longer. Jenny shifted uncomfortably. She'd been leaning against the wall, arms crossed, trying to look detached. But now she stared at Nova, who was resting again in Hazel's lap, one paw curled against her knee. That dog, Jenny muttered. He actually trusts her? Hazel looked up. I mean, Jenny continued, voice quieter now. He's not stupid. He got attacked. He should be freaking out. Why would he still want anyone near him? Hazel stroked Nova's fur. Because he knows who's kind. Jenny's expression flickered. But animals don't think like that. They do, Hazel said simply. He knew I wouldn't leave him. He knows Dr. Amos won't hurt him. He even knows you help, even when you pretend not to. Jenny's face turned red beneath the freckles. I don't help. You left him food, toys, that soft towel. Jenny didn't answer. Hazel looked at her gently. If you were Nova, wouldn't you want someone to believe you still mattered? Jenny stared at Nova, who was watching her now with soft, liquid eyes. After a long silence, she walked over, slowly, and crouched beside them. Nova didn't flinch. He leaned forward, sniffed her fingers, and then, very gently, rested his muzzle on her shoe. Jenny froze. Her voice cracked. Stupid dog. But she didn't move her foot. Dr. Amos cleared his throat. He's clear to go home. Keep the wound clean. Watch for signs of infection. And keep doing what you're doing, Hazel. He's healing. Hazel nodded, lifting Nova carefully into her arms. He curled against her chest, body light but warm. As they left, Jenny walked beside her, not too close but not too far either. On the way out, Hazel glanced back at the photos on the clinic wall. One in particular caught her eye. A black and tan shepherd beside a boy in a wheelchair, both smiling. She didn't have to ask. That was Echo. And Nova, trembling but alive, had just begun to fill a space Echo had once left behind. The sun was kind that morning. Neither harsh nor shy, but gentle in a way that made the sidewalks glow and the wind feel like silk on the skin. Hazel walked with a bounce in her step, Nova trotting beside her in his homemade harness. A small blue vest clipped to his side that read, Reader's Companion, be gentle. His tail flicked lightly, uncertain but excited, as he sniffed the world with renewed courage. It had been 2 weeks since the incident with Bruno, and although Nova still flinched at loud noises, he no longer buried his head in Hazel's lap at the sound of barking from distant yards. He had learned that the world could hurt, but it could also heal. Hazel held the leash with one hand and a canvas bag of books in the other. They were headed to Mapleford Public Library, a red brick building nestled between a bakery and a florist, with ivy crawling up its western wall and a statue of a thoughtful owl guarding the front steps. Inside, the scent of old paper and polished wood met them like an embrace. The library had always been Hazel's place of peace. She'd grown up visiting every Saturday with her father, who used to joke that the building was made of quiet. Now it was something more. A place where Nova could give others the peace he had given her. They were greeted at the front desk by Mrs. Camber, the head librarian, a thin woman in her 60s with short, salt and pepper curls and a voice like chamomile tea. She wore cardigan sweaters year-round, even in summer, and had a way of smiling without showing her teeth, as if always a little unsure how happiness worked but trying nonetheless. After losing her husband a decade ago, she'd thrown herself into community programs, organizing puppet shows, adult literacy nights, and now, with cautious excitement, something brand new. You're right on time, she whispered as Hazel and Nova approached. They're setting up in the children's room. Hazel smiled and nodded, glancing down at Nova. He gave a soft huff, sensing the shift in energy. They made their way through the rows of bookshelves to the back room, where small beanbags had been arranged in a semicircle, crayons and coloring books laid out on a side table. There were 5 children there already, all between the ages of 6 and 10, each one seated awkwardly apart from the others. Some hummed quietly, some stared at their feet, and one boy with dark curls flapped his hands rapidly when he saw Nova. That boy was Ryan, 7 years old, nonverbal, diagnosed with autism at 3. He lived with his single mother, Tara Lang, a nurse who often worked nights and came to the reading program because she believed in quiet miracles. Ryan had never spoken in public. He made sounds, occasionally pointed, but words were like birds, always flying just out of reach. Hazel knelt beside Nova and unclipped the leash. He padded forward slowly, sniffing the carpet, then approached Ryan without hesitation. The boy stopped flapping. His hands dropped to his lap. Nova sat, staring at him with those deep, liquid eyes. Ryan leaned forward and placed a hand, trembling, unsure, on Nova's head. And then, softly, almost like an echo, "Dog." The room froze. Tara, who had been standing against the wall with the other parents, clutched her chest. Hazel felt her breath leave her body in a rush. Nova didn't move. He simply leaned into Ryan's hand, his tail tapping twice against the floor. The session began then, as if the silence had been a key, and Ryan's word had turned it. Hazel sat in the center, Nova lying at her side, and read aloud from Charlotte's Web. The children listened, some rocking gently, some staring into corners but keeping their ears trained on her voice. One girl in a yellow dress named Emily held Nova's paw the entire time. Another child, Max, tried reading a sentence out loud for the first time and stumbled halfway through, only to have Nova lift his head as if in encouragement. Every reaction was small, but none of it was small to Hazel. At the end of the session, Dr. Amos arrived quietly, his ever-worn jacket slung over one arm. He leaned in the doorway, observing, a small smile curling beneath his beard. "You were right," he said later, when the children had left and the room was quiet again. "This dog's not just surviving, he's healing." Hazel looked down at Nova, who now dozed on the beanbag. "He's doing what Echo did, isn't he?" Dr. Amos nodded. "But in his own way. I think we should make this a weekly thing. Reading with Nova. Let the town know." Hazel's eyes lit up. "You mean like a real program?" "A real program," Amos confirmed. "I'll talk to Camber. We'll draw up flyers. Maybe get some volunteers." "Volunteers," Hazel echoed. As if on cue, the door creaked and in stepped Jenny. She wore a black t-shirt with a band name Hazel didn't recognize and jeans that had clearly been patched by hand. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were holding a stack of folded chairs, and she walked over to the corner of the room without being asked. "I heard you needed help," she mumbled. Hazel blinked. "You want to?" "I can set stuff up," Jenny said quickly. "Not good with kids or whatever, but I can, clean, move things, maybe read if I have to." Dr. Amos chuckled. "That's all we need." Mrs. Camber, who had returned to take inventory, approached Jenny with a clipboard. "Could you write your name on here? For volunteer records." Jenny stared at the clipboard as if it had insulted her. "Sure, whatever." She scribbled something that resembled her name and went back to adjusting chairs. Later, as they packed up, Jenny lingered by the shelves, flipping through a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales. Hazel noticed and hesitated before speaking. "You could read one next time, if you want." Jenny scoffed. "I don't read out loud. You could start with a short one." Jenny didn't look up. "Fine." The next week, she read The Fisherman's Wife aloud. Badly, haltingly, her voice stiff with discomfort. But when she finished, one of the kids clapped. Nova wagged his tail. Jenny blinked 3 times in surprise and said nothing. But the next week, she brought her own copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. That night, as Hazel sat with Nova in the backyard, the stars bloomed slowly into view. Ellie brought out a plate of sliced apples and a small bowl of honey for dipping. She said nothing, just placed them down and sat beside Hazel, brushing crumbs from her skirt. Nova rested his head on Hazel's lap, sighing deeply. "He's becoming something more," Hazel whispered. Ellie nodded. "So are you." The morning began with lightness. A sky so blue it felt like a ceiling had been lifted off the town, and a breeze that carried the scent of lilacs through open windows. Hazel was brushing Nova in the backyard, humming an off-key melody as tufts of soft fur floated into the air like dandelion seeds. Nova had grown stronger, his muscles more defined, his legs steadier, his eyes brighter. The only remnants of his early suffering were the faint white scars along his back and the cautious way he still approached unfamiliar men. Ellie watched them from the porch, knitting in her lap and a cup of lukewarm tea beside her. She no longer pretended not to care. On weekends, she boiled Nova's chicken with rosemary and turmeric, a recipe she'd once used for her late husband during his final years. Her affection was practical but steady: woolen blankets in the shed, a new collar she just happened to find on sale, and the way she referred to Nova as our boy when speaking to neighbors. Everything felt like it was beginning again, until the knock came. Hazel opened the front door to find a tall woman in her early 50s standing stiffly on the porch, dressed in a gray blazer too thick for the weather. Her hair was chestnut brown, streaked with white at the temples, twisted into a severe bun. Her lips were pressed so tightly they looked like a seam, and her posture was ramrod straight. Her name was Deborah Langford, and Hazel didn't know her, but Nova did. The moment he saw her, he froze. His ears dropped, his tail tucked low, and he took 2 steps back, placing himself partially behind Hazel. Deborah's eyes narrowed. So it is him. Hazel instinctively moved in front of Nova. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for the dog," Deborah said flatly. "He belonged to my breeding female, Luna. That litter was registered under my name. I have documentation." Hazel's heart thudded. "You abandoned him." "I did no such thing," Deborah replied coolly. "He wandered off, or was taken. That's unclear. But that animal is my property." Hazel shook her head, her voice rising. "He almost died. He was starved, attacked, infected." "Circumstantial," Deborah interrupted. "Your emotional attachment is not legal proof of ownership. I've already contacted animal control. They'll be following up." Ellie appeared behind Hazel, her voice steel. "You'll want to leave now." Deborah glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain. "And you are the legal guardian of this child and the one whose yard he was found dying in." Deborah didn't flinch. "The law may see it differently." When Deborah turned and strode back toward the black sedan idling at the curb, Nova let out the faintest growl. Not aggressive, but low and mournful, like the sound of something ancient surfacing. Hazel dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. "She can't take him," Hazel whispered. "I won't let her." That evening, they gathered in Dr. Amos's kitchen, a space as plain and functional as the man himself. Mismatched mugs sat drying by the sink, and the smell of sage tea hung in the air. Nova lay on a folded blanket in the corner, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of raised voices. Dr. Amos leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "Her name is Deborah Langford. Used to breed German Shepherds out on Highway 9. Had a kennel license revoked 2 years ago, but somehow kept operating under a relative's name." "Isn't that illegal?" Hazel asked. "Not quite. Not until there's proof. But she's being investigated. Again. I've submitted reports in the past. Injuries. Malnourishment. But she's slippery. This time we need witnesses. Records." Ellie, who stood at the kitchen table with her arms folded, spoke up. "You have that, don't you? From when you examined Nova." "I do," Amos said. "And I'm willing to testify. But Hazel, this won't be a one-day thing. You may be asked to speak, to defend why you kept him. You okay with that?" Hazel nodded without hesitation. From the hallway, Jenny's voice came quiet but firm. "Then I'm testifying too." Everyone turned. Jenny stepped into the light, holding a folder of her own, drawings she'd made of Nova, sketches of his progress, photos taken during reading sessions at the library. She was wearing a clean t-shirt, her hair tied back, and for the first time in memory, her eyes didn't hold sarcasm, just defiance. "Dad won't like it," she muttered. "He thinks people like Hazel are wasting time." "Then don't tell him," Ellie said. Jenny smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He'll find out. He always does." 2 days later, the town hall meeting was called. Not a courtroom, but the first public step in the investigation. Deborah Langford had filed a formal claim through the county office, and since the animal was originally part of a registered litter, Hazel's guardianship had to be defended. The room was full. Reporters from the local paper, neighbors, even some of the children from the library program with their parents, holding small signs, "Let Nova stay." Hazel sat in the front row, Nova at her feet in his vest, trembling only slightly. When Deborah entered, wearing a pressed suit and carrying a leather briefcase, Nova's body stiffened. Hazel placed her hand on his back, steadying him. Deborah's lawyer began with rehearsed statements about ownership, lineage, registry tags. But the room shifted when Dr. Amos stood and calmly recounted Nova's injuries. The weight loss, the bite marks, the dehydration. He handed over photos, medical logs, and diagrams. "This dog was left to die," he said plainly. "He survived not because of his breeder, but in spite of her." When Hazel spoke, her voice was small but unwavering. "He's not property," she said. "He's family." Then, unexpectedly, Jenny stood. She wasn't scheduled to speak. She wasn't even on the list. But her voice rang out like a bell. If someone like her can call that dog hers, just because she signed some paper, then what about the rest of us? What about the kids he helps every week? What about Hazel, who stayed up for weeks feeding him with a dropper? If that's not love, then what is? Someone in the back clapped. Then another. Jenny's voice cracked near the end. "If people like me, who got told we weren't worth anything, if we don't deserve kindness, then don't take the one thing that taught us it's real." Silence followed. And Nova, as if understanding his moment, stood and walked to her. He placed his paw gently on her boot. The decision was delayed for review, but no one missed the shift in the air. Public opinion weighed heavy. Deborah left in silence. Outside, Hazel hugged Jenny tightly. "You were brave," she whispered. Jenny rolled her eyes, but her cheeks turned red. "Whatever. I meant it." Nova nudged between them, and for the first time, Jenny knelt and wrapped her arms around him. "He's yours," she murmured. "No one else gets to say otherwise." Mapleford hadn't seen a summer this warm in years. The sky over the small Ohio town opened wide and blue, the sidewalks humming with early June light. Balloons in shades of gold and navy swayed gently from the iron fence outside the public library, tied in clusters with ribbon. Someone had placed a cardboard sign on the lawn, hand-painted in curling script, "Happy First Birthday, Nova, our miracle pup." Inside the library, the world had been transformed. The children's room had been cleared of its usual shelves and beanbags. Folding tables lined the walls, bearing trays of cupcakes, bowls of puppy treats, watercolor portraits of Nova, made by the kids who came weekly to read aloud beside him. A paw-print photo booth stood near the window, where families posed with handmade ears and Nova-shaped cutouts. Near the back, a banner read, "1 year of courage, kindness, and second chances." Nova sat in the middle of it all, calm and dignified in his navy blue vest. He was no longer the trembling, emaciated pup Hazel had found behind the fence. His coat, now sleek and full, shone like warm bronze beneath the sunlight filtering through the windows. His eyes had grown steadier, more knowing, yet still carried that depth that made people stop mid-sentence and simply meet his gaze. Hazel knelt beside him, adjusting the collar of his vest. She had grown, too, not much in height, but in poise, in the quiet strength of someone who had lived through something important and come out with a softer, brighter heart. Her hair, pulled into 2 tidy braids, swayed as she moved from table to table greeting guests. She wore a button-up shirt that read Nova's Team, across the back in embroidered thread. A gift from Jenny. Speaking of whom, Jenny stood near the refreshment table with a paper plate of cookies in hand, half listening to a conversation with a reporter from the Mapleford Gazette. Her once disheveled hair had been neatly pulled into a ponytail, and she wore clean jeans and a school-branded hoodie that still surprised most who saw her in it. She didn't smile often, but today her eyes lit up whenever someone asked her about Nova, especially when she talked about her essay. The Mapleford Youth Community Scholarship had never made headlines before. But this year, Jenny Harrow's submission, Nova, the dog who taught me to forgive, had been picked unanimously. In it, she'd written about what it meant to feel unwanted, how cruelty echoes louder when no one listens, and how one half-starved dog with scars and a quiet bark helped her believe in goodness again. If he can forgive the world for hurting him, the essay ended. Maybe I can learn to do the same. Across the room, Dr. Amos stood near the window with Ellie, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. He looked lighter now, the stiff set of his shoulders softened over the past months. He still walked with a slight limp and still favored wool jackets even in June, but his eyes had lost their burdened shadow. Ellie glanced toward Hazel and Nova, her voice low. I never thought a dog would open all this. Amos smiled beneath his beard. Sometimes healing doesn't knock. Sometimes it scratches at the back door, half dead and full of hope. They both chuckled softly, watching as Nova allowed a group of toddlers to gently press stickers on his vest. He remained still, noble, almost regal. Not far from them, Mrs. Camber, the librarian, wiped tears from her eyes and blew her nose noisily into a monogrammed handkerchief. She had worn her Reading Matters brooch and her nicest cardigan for the event. You know, she sniffed, I was against pets in the building. Thought it'd ruin the carpet. But this one, he's more polite than most of our patrons. Hazel had spent the past week preparing for the celebration. She had made the guest list, organized decorations, and, with Amos's help, put together a slideshow of Nova's first year. Photos of him from those early days flashed across the library projector screen. The first time he stood, the first bark, his recovery after Bruno's attack, his slow crawl onto Ryan's lap, his first real wag. The audience laughed and cried in equal measure. When the slideshow ended, Hazel took the mic. She looked smaller behind the podium, the crowd of adults and kids towering around her. But her voice didn't waver. I just wanted to say thank you, she began, to everyone who helped Nova live and grow and become who he is now. He's not just my dog. He belongs to all of us, because everyone in this room showed him that love is louder than fear. Her eyes found Jenny in the crowd. And forgiveness is something we all learn, even if it takes time. Then she smiled down at Nova. I think he wants to say something too. Hazel stepped back and Nova, prompted by some quiet understanding, let out a single bark. Not loud, not forceful, just certain. The room erupted into cheers. Later, after the cupcakes had been eaten and the paper decorations had been packed away, Dr. Amos lingered in the library lobby with Hazel and Jenny. I want to tell you both something, he said, clearing his throat. I've decided to reopen the clinic. Hazel's eyes went wide. Really? Really? Amos confirmed. And I'd like a part-time assistant, someone with sharp instincts and a good heart. He looked at Hazel. You interested? She couldn't find her voice fast enough. She nodded furiously, tears welling. And you, he turned to Jenny, that essay of yours. It reminded me why I started all this in the first place. You ever want to volunteer with me? Help with the rescues, maybe even intern. I'll make space. Jenny looked away, but she was smiling. That night, when they got home, Hazel sat on the window seat with Nova beside her. The first snowfall of the season had come early, covering the town in a hush of white. Outside, the lamplight scattered across rooftops like sugar, and inside, everything felt quiet in a good way. Nova curled beside her, his head resting against her leg. He watched the snow fall with that same gaze that had once held nothing but pain, but now shimmered with something else. Calm, wonder, peace. Hazel stroked his ears. Happy birthday, Nova. Nova looked up, licked her hand once, and then gave a single soft bark. Just one. But it was enough. Final reflection, a lesson wrapped in fur and grace. Maybe the real miracles don't come in flashes of light or parted seas. Maybe they arrive quietly, on 4 trembling legs, wrapped in scars and silence, waiting at the edge of someone's backyard. Maybe they come when a little girl, broken by grief, chooses compassion over convenience, and love over fear. Nova didn't just survive. He became a beacon, a reminder that God often sends his angels in unexpected forms. Not with wings, but with wagging tails and eyes that see our hurting hearts. And through Hazel, through Jenny, through Dr. Amos, we are reminded that every act of mercy is a prayer answered. Every choice to love is a piece of heaven brought to earth. If you believe that God's love reaches even the voiceless, that he blesses those who protect the weak, then please share the story with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe love still wins. Subscribe for more stories that show how even the smallest among us can carry the greatest light. And may the Lord bless you, for every tear shed, every smile shared, every soul you choose to see. God sees it too.